So wonderful to have so many of you here joining us at the Capitol campus here for Georgetown University. If you're able, there are plenty of seats, so please come join us. There's even seats on the far side of this room, so please come join us. We're so glad to have so many of you here. My name is Kimberly Mazik, and I'm the Associate Director for the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. We're so excited to be co-sponsoring this evening with the Francesco Collaborative, which I know a lot of you are in town for the summit this week. And they're a real leader in promoting and putting ideas into action, which we'll be talking more about tonight. So a special welcome also to about 1,000 people who are joining us online this evening. So this is just such a great opportunity to be with all of you. Tonight, we're discussing impact investing and the ways that financial capital can contribute to the vision of a common good. Early in his pontificate, Pope Francis warned that an idolatry of money threatens to, quote, devour everything which stands in the way of increased profits, close quote, with the environment and the vulnerable members of society, quote, defenseless before the interest of a deified market, which becomes the only rule, close quote. Pope Benedict also wrote in Caritas in Veritate, the Church's social doctrine has always maintained that justice must be applied to every phase of economic activity, because this is always concerned with man and his needs. Locating resources, financing, production, consumption, and all the other phases of the economic cycle inevitably have moral implications. Thus, every economic decision has a moral consequence. But that does not mean that money is inherently evil, right? You guys are a prime example of all that. By putting our resources to proper use, focusing first and foremost on the common good and the issues afflicting the most vulnerable in our society, Catholics can support projects and institutions that improve society and build strong communities. This is exactly what impact investing aims to do: generate measurable social and environmental benefits alongside financial return. So tonight, I have some amazing people here for this discussion. I want to introduce them to you. First, to my right, immediate right, is Sister Sue Ernster, who is the president of the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. She previously served as the congregation's vice president and treasurer and has ministered in campus ministry as well, parish administration and faith formation. She serves on the board of the Economy of Francesco and advances the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration's impact investing efforts. Welcome. We also have Elizabeth Garlow with us. She's the chair of the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative and co-founder of the Francesco Collaborative, which helps investors live out Catholic social teaching values through practices of discernment and solidarity. She's served in the Obama White House, the Lumina Foundation, Accione, and is a senior fellow at New America. Welcome, Elizabeth. We also have David Harley, co-founder and CEO of Third Way Capital, an impact investment firm supporting small and medium enterprises in sub-Saharan Africa. He previously held executive roles at an engineering firm, WSP, and teaches distributive capitalism at IE University. He's also the author of Building the New Economy, Distributive Capitalism, which just came out in 2025. So that will be a link that you'll be able to look at and see where his book is. And finally, my colleague at Georgetown, Cal Watson. He's the Associate Vice President for Public Affairs and Business Policy at Georgetown University, where he leads efforts to align the university's business policies with its Catholic and Jesuit mission. He chairs the Advisory Committee on Business Practices, coordinates the work of the Committee on Investments in Social Responsibility, and serves on the board of the Workers' Rights Consortium. We'll be taking questions from the audience here after we hear from everyone here tonight for part of this discussion when we get to the Q&A period. And for those of us joining on the live stream, please share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag ImpactInvestingCST and tagging GUCST Public Life. So let's get the conversation started. So what I want to start out is just asking a question for all of you to think about. I mentioned Pope Francis earlier, but Pope Francis once emphasized that the economy is meant to serve people. How do we ensure that the economy and the way we work within our financial systems prioritizes progress for people and the planet? So, Cal, you get to lead off and start answer the question for us. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Kim, and it's an honor to be here with all of you this evening. This is, of course, a complex challenge that requires a variety of different strategies and approaches to build a more just and sustainable economy. A few different things that we should think about. We should think about the impact that we can have as individual consumers and investors, about the role of the institutions that we're a part of, as well as the role of government at the local, state, and federal levels. At the individual level, we all make decisions every day, all the time, about which products to buy, and in other cases, which companies to invest in our own personal capacities. Guided by Catholic social teaching, we should consider which businesses we want to support. How do they treat their workers? What impact are they having on their local communities in which they're operating in? What steps are they taking to protect the environment and address climate change? We should also be thinking about the institutions and organizations that we're involved in and ask the same questions about their business practices, including their procurement and investment policies. And then finally, we should think about the laws and regulations that govern our economy. Are these public policies prioritizing people and the planet? So this evening's gathering is a great opportunity to have this discussion, and I know we'll be talking about some of the strategies involved here, and I'm very much looking forward to that. Thank you.
And Sue, I think I wanted to go to you first, but can you also try to answer that question? How do we ensure that the economy and the way we work within our financial systems prioritizes people and the planet?
I'm going to speak a little bit. Hi, everyone. I'm going to speak a little bit to also Catholic social thought as this incredible lighthouse for how we approach this question. And I think for many of us, we've been exploring in this community how Catholic social thought is actually a reorientation of an inner posture. It's a formation in thinking about these questions differently. It's not a technical exercise. It's not a, let me check this box so I'm improving the lives for people or taking care of the planet. No, it's actually a fundamental orientation toward shared flourishing. And I think it helps us in this realm of financial decision-making and investing. It helps us move from thinking about stewardship as preservation for individual accumulation to stewardship as co-participation in the creation and reconciliation of life, right? And so I think for many of us, this work of, asking the more foundational questions of what is the purpose of our finance and investing is really invited by Catholic social thought and Catholic social teaching principles. It helps us think about how we are trying to facilitate shared life on this planet at this time. And we are living in an existential time. This is a time where, for many of us, we see day in, day out that we don't have a lot of time. And so we actually can't afford to spend a lot of time trying to invent some new, technocratic approach or solution. We need to act now. And I think what Catholic social thought invites us into is to really be focused on how we need to have our own moments of conversion of mind and heart so that we can actually approach the decision-making roles that we carry with dignity in mind, first and foremost.
Thank you. Sister Sue, I want to come to you with that same question.
Well, thank you. We have really looked at this through the lens of our values and how we can continue to be in mission, because it's very evident to most people that know anything about religious life right now, our numbers are not as large as they used to be. And so we are looking at how we can be in mission and use our assets to be in mission, because we can no longer be in mission and have the same presence we had before. And so investing through the lens of Catholic social teaching and our values of being in right relationship really are a priority for us.
Great, thank you. And David, I come to you last.
Thank you. about a decade ago, when I was graduating from business school, I had a conversation with my econ prof and said, should I do an economics PhD? And I was thinking I'd do it on her. And she said, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't waste my time with that. And I said, well, why not? And she said, because the field is narrowing to the point where there's nothing new being discovered. It's become completely econometrics focused. I think that's part of the problem, that both primarily the field of economics has become sort of this sacred, untouchable ground, and any kind of progress that you make has to be very minute, and it has to be primarily mathematical. And there's so much room for new ideas. When you think about Catholic social teaching and sort of a broader humanities approach to economics, there's so much that has to go into it if that space is going to be true to what it's trying to solve, which is the allocation of scarce resources. And that's just not happening. So the field's stuck. On the other hand, you've got business schools sort of teaching tried and tested and failed business practice in terms of how do we think about multiple stakeholder business, how do we account for the externalities of businesses, how do we think about communities, all the stuff that we discuss 20 years after we graduate, we should be discussing at 18, 19, 20. The point I'm trying to make is I think the conduit for this shift is largely going to be an education system. As sort of a part-time educator myself, I see particularly with a country like the USA, the richness of Catholic institutions here, if there was to be the energy around, momentum around taking these ideas into mainstream education, that economics and business should be broader, and that it should be generative, it should be human-centered, and it should seek the outcome of flourishing. That's probably ground zero for me.
Thank you, David. So Elizabeth, I'm going to come back to you. You work with the Francesco Collaborative and with the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative that emphasizes not just doing impact investing, but transforming the underlying assumptions of finance, from focusing on increasing growth at all costs to putting faith in people at the center. I mean, you even talked about that, we're talking about acting now. From your experience working with investors, what is the mindset shift that is most difficult for them to make within this framework? And how is your formation work informed by this?
So what David just mentioned about scarcity as a fundamental logic that sort of governs our economic logic, I think is at the root of a lot of how people internalize their own approach to financial decision making. And if you look at our system, we have a financial system that is premised on capital supremacy and really a logic that is about financial maximization. And so to unwind that is complex in a system that is fundamentally oriented around that logic. And so a lot of folks in our community, as I'm walking with investors on this journey, they all say, I'm doing a lot of unlearning. I've had a lot of my own inherited logics and assumptions about how this all works and how this operates, which maybe is why we have to go back to the foundational educational system, right? And how we are thinking about these logics. But I think this shift from a sort of logic of capital supremacy, and one that first and foremost often looks at a narrow lens, offers a narrow lens on risk that is primarily financial, right? So in financial decision making, we tend to have notions of risk that are primarily focused on, the risk of losing your capital or the risk of volatility. And so how might we expand and nuance our understanding of risk to include impact risk, to include the risk of not having a livable future? This is part of what we discuss as we're working with investors. So I think I'll pause there.
Sure, and even as you talk about a livable future, the Francesco Collaborative uses a livable future investing spectrum. So in practical terms, what are you guys evaluating, and how does it bring faith and change into this evaluation? I mean, how do you educate people about this?
Yeah, I would say the livable future investing spectrum for us is kind of pointing out different levels of consciousness as people are going on this journey. So we might start with something that is about harm reduction. How do we reduce the amount of harm that we are complicit in, given where our capital is held or where it's flowing? But then as we move into deeper relationship with people who are benefiting or being extracted from, and deepen in our understanding of these questions like, where is this wealth coming from? Where is it being extracted from? Then we can start to move from avoiding harm to actually thinking about contributing to solutions, right, that help architect a more just economy. Now, I think baked in that, if we go back to Catholic social thought, there's a very rich lineage to draw upon. And so in the spectrum work that we've been developing and using with investors, we look at concepts like solidarity. We are all for all. And how do we structure solidarity into our actual investments, into our transactions, by thinking about who benefits and who's paying the cost? And that is something that often doesn't necessarily get baked into transactions when, again, we're resorting to those narrow definitions of risk and return, right? We look at also these concepts of, what is subsidiarity look like in decision-making at the investor level? And I think there's a rich and growing body of people who are trying to bring worker voice, community voice into their investment decision-making processes, whether that's at the committee level, the board level, but then also thinking again about what is the burden that we are placing on communities. How do we bring their voice in here in a way that really honors their dignity, their lived experience, but also recognizes that the burden is on the investor, and who are we accountable to ultimately, right? So lots of rich reflection that comes from Catholic social thought in that work.
Right. So when you talk about accountability, and I'm turning to Cal now, and you're the chair of Georgetown University's Advisory Committee on Business Practices and Licensing Oversight Committee, and you also coordinate the work of Georgetown's Committee on Investments and Social Responsibility. And I know within that, there's a lot of accountability, like who are you accountable to? But how do you see this work on the Committee on Investments and Social Responsibility serving the mission of the university as it tries to grow its endowment? Like, how do we make sure we take care of our students, but how do you do that in a way that also is accountable to who are your stakeholders, right?
So Georgetown University is the first Catholic and Jesuit university in the country, 230 years old. We want to keep going for another 236 years, and our endowment is the primary driver for providing for the long-term sustainability and viability of our educational mission. So it's really important that we're working to achieve the highest level of return possible in our investments. At the same time, we want to make sure we're doing that in a manner that's consistent with our Catholic and Jesuit identity and our values. So to help guide this work, about 8 years ago, the Georgetown's Board of Directors sort of took a step back and created a working group on socially responsible investing. And that working group came up with a policy that was adopted by the whole Board of Directors on socially responsible investing. So that SRI policy is really our guiding star now for the university's investment office. The policy includes a few key strategies. The first is avoiding certain investments based on Catholic social teaching and church doctrine. The second is making sure that we're using our voice as a shareholder in the companies that we're invested in to vote on different shareholder resolutions related to social responsibility and sustainability. And then finally, it includes considering making investments that generate a positive social impact. So those are the sort of core elements of the SRI policy. And then Georgetown's Committee on Investments and Social Responsibility, or CISR for short, as Kim mentioned, is really charged with providing advice to the Board of Directors and the Investment Office on how to implement the SRI policy. And the committee includes student, faculty, and staff representatives, as well as our Chief Investment Officer and a representative from our Office of Mission and Ministry. So the sort of two key functions of CISR are making recommendations on how to vote the university's proxies, during each annual shareholder meeting season, and reviewing proposals that are submitted by members of the Georgetown community. So just one quick example of CISR's work over the last about 8 to 10 years has been reviewing a series of proposals from a student organization called GU Fossil Free related to the proposal calling on the university to divest from fossil fuel companies. So in reviewing those proposals and engaging with the student organization, CISR ultimately recommended to the Board of Directors that the university should take a phased approach to divesting from fossil fuel companies. The board ultimately accepted that recommendation, and we're in the middle of that process now. So that's just one example. There's a few others we could speak to, but just the collaborative nature of CISR, I think, is really important in providing those perspectives, not only from the board in our investment office, but making sure that our students, faculty, and staff are engaged in this process as well.
Yeah. So Cal, you're also involved with the Workers' Right Consortium. You serve on the board of that. It's an independent labor rights monitoring organization. And I know we've talked a little bit about that, but how does protecting workers' right and safety contribute to sustainable investing? Especially, what does it mean for a university that, people want Nike shoes and all those things? So how does that work?
It's a great question. And, when we talk about sustainable investing, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about protecting people as well as the planet. And that includes, of course, respecting the rights of workers and protecting their safety. I just want to share a quote here from Pope Francis from Laudato Si. "Work is a necessity, part of the meaning of life on this earth, a path to growth, human development, and personal fulfillment. Helping the poor financially must always be a provisional solution in the face of pressing needs. The broader objective should always be to allow them a dignified life through work." End quote. So at Georgetown, one of the ways that we express that commitment to worker rights is through our involvement with the Worker Rights Consortium, or the WRC. We like our acronyms. So Georgetown was the founding member of the WRC in 2000. WRC is celebrating its 25th anniversary over this next year. And for the last few years, I've had the privilege of serving on the WRC's board of directors. The WRC plays an important role in the collegiate apparel industry. So Georgetown and other colleges and universities, all the university-branded sweatshirts and T-shirts and baseball caps that we sell in our college stores and online, we want to make sure that those are being produced ethically, that the workers in factories around the world are being paid fairly and treated respectfully as they make these products. And one of the key ways that we do that is working with the WRC. As Kim said, they're an independent labor rights monitoring organization. They're headquartered here in DC, but they have field staff around the world in the main apparel producing regions of the world. And they develop local relationships on the ground with workers and trade unions. So they hear firsthand if there's concerns in a particular factory, and they'll go in and they'll investigate, and they'll determine if there's any violations of labor standards based on the codes of conduct that Georgetown and the other colleges that are part of the WRC have adopted and incorporated into our license agreements with these brands. If there is an issue that's identified, the WRC staff works with the factory management and the brands that are sourcing from that factory to address the issue. And just one example of the WRC's impact over the years, it secured more than $135 million in legally mandated compensation for workers, which the workers never would have received if it weren't for the WRC's intervention. So I know, on behalf of Georgetown, we're incredibly proud of the work that they do.
Great, thank you. Sister Sue, you are the president of your order, the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration, religious order that has been in the forefront of investing and with impact, as Catholic sisters often are. Elizabeth talked a lot about subsidiarity, but I want you to talk a little bit about how your community decided to move towards impact investing, what considerations went into that decision, and how do you govern and navigate managing your endowment? Especially, I'm going to lead into, many of you probably know that Sister Sue's community recently returned parcel of land to an indigenous community. A decision that could have made a lot of money for the endowment of the sisters, correct?
That is correct. Thank you for reminding us of that.
But subsidiarity and relationships.
It's all about the relationships. And you asked about how we got started. In 2018, we as a congregation divested from one of our sponsored ministries and received a good chunk of money. We also know that we didn't need the money for our needs because of how we have been blessed up until now. So we made the decision to use half the funds that we received for impact investing and half for philanthropy. We, at that time, pandemic then hit. We participated in Livable Futures, and also we were in the midst of articles coming out regarding boarding schools. We had administered a boarding school in northern Wisconsin, and so we began the path of truth and healing, really acknowledging our complicity in the harms that have been done, and we participated in the system, and we've benefited from the system. So the impact investing has really allowed us and really benefited us in claiming our values, in claiming who we are, and really living into those, especially about right relationships. And in 2018, one of the movements we chose to embrace was unveiling our white privilege. So we know that with our white privilege comes a responsibility. And also with that responsibility, we need to take action. So we've been on the path and have made the decision to invest where the impact has greater precedence than the financial return. That has taken some learning to do as well as unlearning. And one of the examples where we had to kind of not necessarily work with our broker on this, but we made the decision because it was part of our values, was one of the first investments we made in early on was in a company that is taking contract for deeds for people who have lived in redlined areas and turned them into more affordable mortgages, usually decreasing the percentage of monthly payments from 20 to 40%. So that affects us because we value housing and making sure that people have housing. And so that is one area where impact took precedence over what would be considered a risky investment because it was a newer organization which didn't have a tried and true track record. And so we are now continuing, because we stepped into this without having all the guardrails in place, we are now continuing the path of putting the guardrails in place and really being very cognizant about the decisions we make and realizing what the decisions we make now affect up to 7 generations from now. We're looking really forward and knowing that our decisions cannot only benefit humans, our decisions need to benefit the planet as well, because we are all connected. And what benefits one benefits all. And we are implementing separate investment policy statements, knowing that the impact needs to take a greater priority over the return. We also know that we need to care for our members. We have enough funds now to care for our members and to be a mission. And we know that as we continue looking forward, we need to discern what is enough for us and how do we share the gifts we've been given above what our needs are. And that includes what is it that is enough for us? When we look at that, it's, do all of our investments need to get the highest return, or can we have the mix of taking some that have greater impact with the lower financial return?
Right. Wow. So, and as you continue to do this, what is the reaction from your community? How are you educating your sisters or others in the community about these decisions that you're making? Because there might be someone, maybe not in this room, who would say, those aren't great financial decisions.
They may not be financial decisions, they are our value decisions. And our existence is to promote the gospel, what we believe in with the gospel. And so that is going to be counterintuitive at times to society and the culture. And as we step into the providence and trusting of God, God always, always returns.
It is intuitive, right?
It's counterintuitive at times, and we put the relationship, the healing that can happen rather than the division. You mentioned the land back that happened on Halloween, and this was a process because we ran a boarding school, so we know and we had to acknowledge, and this has taken time with our sisters because it's hard to acknowledge at times that we didn't do everything exactly perfectly. We were doing the best we could, the best we knew. Now that we know differently, we have to act differently. And it's made us aware of the need for deep listening and engaging in dialogue, because we knew we could no longer be the best stewards of the space that we had 4 hours north of where our mother house is. And we wanted to have a like-minded and valued organization that would value the land as much as us to be the recipients. And so for us, engaging with the tribe was our first and really the best decision we could make with this parcel of land, and what we can do now to disrupt the system that continues to harm.
Right. Amen. David, you're the CEO of the Third Way Capital, an impact investment firm serving small and medium-sized businesses in sub-Saharan Africa. You're also a faculty member at IE Business School, where you teach distributive capitalism, exploring the concepts and practice of distributed ownership through the worlds of academia and investing. Help us understand how impact investing differs from traditional forms of return, and how is it different as an investor in sub-Saharan Africa working with small and medium enterprises?
So we've spoken a lot about sort of the market returns, and it's often the thing that we use that gets thrown at us when we're in discussions with investors. We talk about how does that compare to market. And I think when you're thinking about an impact investment, it's almost better to think about it as a systems investment. And that's language that I wish was used more, but hasn't really caught on. Certainly where we work, it's very true. And by that, I mean that if you take any investment, you have a return to the market. They call it beta, and then you got your alpha return, which is idiosyncratic. The market return that we all enjoy in the developed economy is sort of taken for granted. That if you bought an ETF that was pegged to S&P, for instance, what you would enjoy is a market return. So when people say market returns, what they're really saying is the U.S. market plus some alpha. But again, the assumption is a developed market return. In the spaces that we work, whether it's in Africa or whether it's in disadvantaged communities here, these are economies or sub-economies that actually are not participating in some ways in that market. And so if you're going to set your stall out as being interested in impact in investment, you almost have to start from the assumption that you won't be enjoying that market return, at least not in the same time frame, because markets take time to develop. And so often, we'll talk about things like patient capital, and it's only when you pull out the time frame that you can start to talk about something that's more competitive to what we generally benchmark against, because markets take time to develop. In that regard, I think impact investment first and foremost, if you're going to get into it, it's disabusing yourself of that anchor to the market return, because by definition, when we say we're going to impact investing, we're saying we want to enter a market that's disadvantaged. So why then would it make sense to peg your return, benchmark your return to a developed market? So that's probably the biggest difference. And so I mentioned time scales as well. The good news is, for most investments here, what you're calling your market return, what you're enjoying is that return to alpha. If you are patient enough to watch a community develop, to watch an economy develop, we believe that actually can be outsized return. Of course, that will be borne out in time, whether or not that's true, but the math suggests that it is. If you look at historically what countries like India or what China have done, albeit that they haven't developed in the ways that we've hoped that they would develop. If you're comparing the performance of a country that did 18% GDP versus the Western countries that did 3 to 6%, you can see that over 20, 30 years, you should expect in some of these environments that you will actually do really well. So I think it's really going back to investing 101 and understanding what it is that you're trying to achieve. And if it is a systemic investment, then I think it's apples and oranges. It's a false equivalency to bring in a market piece. In regards to the SME space, in Africa. I would say, obviously, you've got this added layer of the political and economic complexities of the areas in which we're investing, where there's a different kind of risk, I would say. I wouldn't even say that the risk is necessarily higher, and I'll explain that. A tech investment here is a really high risk investment. And we know that because tech investors will generally invest in 100 companies and hope that there's a unicorn because they expect something like a 90% failure rate. The reason it works is that they understand where the risk is, they know how to mitigate for it, and they can build a model around that. And so often when people look at sub-Saharan Africa, they see, what they hear on the news or what have you, and say, well, there's just risk. But there's a population of people who work within that risk. They have jobs, they raise their families go to school. In fact, there's a bunch of multinationals that make their money in those markets, Western multinationals, your Coca-Cola, your Unilever, whoever else. So clearly there's a way to make it work in those markets, and the difference is they've learned. They've learned where the risk is, they've learned how to mitigate the risk, they've learned the nuances of the market. And so I wouldn't say that, there's something, the differences, there's certainly differences, but I wouldn't say, broadly speaking, that the risk profile is completely asymmetric from what we see in impact investing here, just that you have to be on the ground, you have to understand the nuances of investing in those regions, and then you can be successful and have the impacts that you're pursuing.
David, I know in your book you talk about distributive capitalism, right? So as you work in academia and investing, how do you see models of distributive ownership, such as employee ownership, co-ops, and shared equity scaling in these emerging markets? I mean, I think that when people hear about that, they think, well, you've already talked about the political and other risks that people are thinking about with sub-Saharan Africa, but when people think about co-ownership, when they hear that, they immediately think, oh.
Yeah. So I would say culturally, there's definitely some synergy there because Africans are used to thinking communally. And I think that's the power of this model there. In fact, when African countries, the first wave of independence and actually the second wave of independence, there was a lot of focus on the socialist model because it seemed like the thing that was closest to what we knew from our tribal models. And we found out the hard way that hardcore, got to be careful with the S word here, but hardcore socialism didn't reap the rewards that we hope that it will. And so we've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater and we've gone to the other side where a lot of African countries are kind of neoclassical economics, laissez-faire economics, and we're hoping that'll work for them. And so I see the potential here of basically seeding an economic system that leans into the cultural context and the cultural traditions of Africans, but in a way that doesn't require centralization with government and what have you, in a way that empowers the individual, which is what distributed capitalism does. However, given the landscape, there are some challenges. One of those is that these models often rely on share ownership, which sometimes requires an exit and what have you, before employees are remunerated for their participation. And in places where it's tough living, so to speak, people are much more short-term oriented. And so they really want to solve their day-to-day problems. How am I going to put my kid through school or buy this drug for my kid who's at home sick? And so it's hard to sell that model of distributive capitalism. We're having to be much more creative. It's sort of, can we look at profit share models where actually the profit share is much more aggressive in terms of timelines? Maybe it's every half a year instead of every year. Those models are more interesting. The great thing about this space is there's so much room to innovate. All we're really saying is people should participate in the fruits of a successful business beyond income. So that can look like a number of things. It can look like a cooperative. It can look like a trust system that provides a profit share. It can look like phantom equity, where they never actually really own equity, because sometimes that can be punitive from a tax standpoint, but they can still enjoy the benefits of a performing business. So there's so much room. And often when you talk about co-ownership, again, people think about lots of people figuring out the business together. And it's not that. I mean, the business will still have hierarchy. People that are most qualified will still make the decisions. It's just that, there's a share in the profits. And then often there's influence at the board level where the employees can pick a representative on the board who will have their interests at heart, interests of the communities that they live in, and what have you. So certainly it doesn't look the same everywhere, but I think the thing with the book was to sell the large concept, create a big tent and say, we should be talking about how we democratize the marketplace, whatever that means in the context.
I think for those of us who focus on Catholic social teaching, it's really holding up solidarity and subsidiary at the same time, right? So I know a lot of you have really great experience, and I know we're going to move to questions in the room. I think I have my own personal question, so we'll see how this plays out. So we're talking a lot about investment and things that have happened in communities and how universities and institutions make these decisions. What about the average individual in this room? So I'm just somebody who's working at a university, and I want to make sure that when I'm old, which is in the next 5 years, how do I make sure I have enough money in my 401k, my 403p? But what does that mean for me as I can think about retirement? How should I be thinking in many of the same ways that you who are really involved in investing? How should I be thinking about that? Elizabeth, you're nodding.
I'm nodding. Well, I guess I've thought a lot about this, Kim. I think many in this room have thought about this. I want to lift up actually that in the Catholic community and lineage, we have some very rich examples and guides for how we think about this question. I think part of why I wanted to come into this space at the intersection of faith and finance is because 53 years ago, Catholic sisters were grappling with this exact question. They said, okay, we have retirement savings. Okay, we're operating in communities that are experiencing tremendous disinvestment from redlining, from discriminatory policies, from finance institutions that are never going to serve their needs. So how are we going to walk the talk here with our retirement savings, with our funds? And so they started pooling their resources and investing in the first community-owned banks and credit unions, like Shore Bank in Chicago, right? That gave birth to what is today the community development finance movement, right? So the kind of willingness to turn to your values, as Sister Sue was talking about, to turn to our faith traditions, to trust in providence, to trust in the abundance of God's economy, undergirds courageous decisions that create and open up entirely new avenues for how we invest our money, for how we think about what's enough, this question of enough. So yes, there are thankfully growing opportunities to take your retirement savings and move them into organizations like Just Futures, who's here in the room, that are doing really thoughtful retirement planning with organizations focused on, mission and values aligned work. There's also this question of, how much do you need? What Sister Sue talked about at the community level happens at every household level, right? We have to think about that. What is enough for us? What do we need? And how do we embrace simplicity as an ethic in our own lives? And I think that's so much of what Catholic social thought has called us into, right? In particular, as we've been invited by Benedict XVI, and then in Centesimus Annus, and then Pope Francis in Laudato Si, to really recognize that all of this is interlinked. So how our money is flowing in the economy is interlinked with the cries of the earth and the cries of the poor, right? And so I think this is actually a very empowering message for all of us, that we are all investors in our own ways, right? With the money that we have, with where we're flowing it, and that we have some incredible guides and witnesses in our tradition that we can turn to who have been taking these courageous leaps.
Thank you for that. I'm going to see if there are any questions in the room. I see a question all the way back here. You're waving at me. Somebody's going to bring a microphone to you, so.
Great, thank you. Great event. So in Baltimore, Catholic bishops issued a statement objecting to U.S. immigration tactics. Now I'm wondering how you will blend that into your investment strategies.
Could you please repeat the question? I didn't hear it fully.
Sure.
Okay, so in Baltimore, Catholic bishops just issued a statement in defense of immigrants in opposition to the administration's immigration policies. There's been a lot of talk in the investment field. I'm an economist about this historically, so I'm wondering if how you will blend that into your investment strategies. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Are you interested in taking the question or no?
I can start with the question. I'll start with with a potential answer. That would be one of the avenues, because dignity of the human person and the common good are core to our values and really essential to meeting the needs of the times right now. So immigrants and how anything that we would invest in would benefit them would have a part to play, as well as if they were being harmed. So it's not only the immigrants, it would be anyone that is being disrespected by any aspects of the actions being taken.
Another question? It's a shy audience. There's somebody up front, right here in the very front row. Thanks, Blaine.
Hi,
Hi.
Gabriel. I want to thank the panel and everyone who's talked to what it takes to change the thoughts and mindsets to enact your values in your investing. And I want to acknowledge the leadership in divesting from fossil fuels. I work on shareholder democracy and creating a future where everyone votes all their votes with their values. And if only Catholics did that, for example, we would transform all publicly traded corporations. So I'm curious, could you, Cal, speak a little bit about how the endowment is voted? What I'm learning is that a lot of endowments are voted against the values or the mission of the philanthropy or the institution that they represent. Do you, for instance, by default vote with Sister Sue, or might that be something you'd consider?
It's a great question.
I didn't mean to get you.
No. Any of the direct investments that the university has, annual shareholder season comes around, our investment office shares those shareholder resolutions related to social responsibility, sustainability, worker rights, labor, racial justice, with the Committee on Investments and Social Responsibility. And we divide that up amongst ourselves, and we or sort of assign it out based on different topic areas, and it's depending on the resolution. If it's mine, I research the issue. I make a recommendation to the committee on how I think the university should vote on that particular proposal based on Georgetown's Catholic and Jesuit values and Catholic social teaching. The committee votes on that internally to decide what recommendation we want to bring forward to the investment office, and then the investment office places the university's vote based on the committee's recommendations. So that's the way that we structure that internally.
I'd also like to answer that question. We as well as Georgetown really utilize shareholder advocacy, and we have divested as well as engaging companies, and that is part of the work. It's not one aspect of investing. We need the entire spectrum of investing. The shareholder advocacy, the impact investing, and the other investing without harm. And the shareholder advocacy it's a much slower realm, and it develops the relationship with the companies. And when there is respectful dialogue, much change does happen, even at a slow pace. It's the respectful dialogue rather than antagonism that will get the ball to continue to roll.
Yeah, I think it was much what Elizabeth was saying about patience, right?
Yes, it's patience.
Right. It's hard to believe that our time is almost up, so I want to ask a closing question. I'm going to beg everybody. I know there might be others with questions, but the question I wanted to go with everyone at the end is, because it's good for us to tell people how we think, but how would you advise those in the audience, both here in the room and those online joining us, to support impact investing? How can we contribute to a future of investing that protects people and our planet. And Elizabeth, I'll come to you first.
Okay. I've been revisiting scripture recently and learned that when Jesus talks about money a lot. He talks about wealth a lot. And I think in 18 of his 31 parables, he specifically addresses the concept of wealth. And most of the time advises us to not hoard wealth. And so I think this invitation for all of us in these times, if we are to be co-participating in the flourishing of life on this planet at this time, is to really reflect on where we can flow resources to where they serve life, to where they're most needed, in communities, in place, with people who are building the new economy structures, right? So again, this is part of that mindset and heart shift of, moving from protect and preserve to free and flow for purposes of building an economy rooted in communion. So I think, practically speaking, what does that look like? I think it means taking a look at our own household economies. Oikonomia is the management of the household. Let's start with ourselves. Let's start with our own households. Think about our own saving practices, our own investment practices, asking your wealth advisors different kinds of questions. They're often not used to getting these kinds of questions. And the more we ask them, the more we can start to shift the conversation, change the dialogue. And that goes the same for organizations and institutional investors. The other thing I would say is, because we have a set of dominant practices that, default us into profit maximization, we need each other to be trying to figure this out. So we need to look to each other for how we find different kinds of investment opportunities and how we practically move our money into them. And that is the purpose of a collaborative, right? Is to say, oh, we are better together. We can do this together. So even if we are encountering resistance with capital intermediaries that maybe can't do that for us, let's look to one another and figure out how we can do it.
They're doing it together. Great. Cal.
Just to build on that point, I think it's about creating demand, in the marketplace for these types of investment vehicles that, include social responsibility, sustainability. For example, Vanguard, Fidelity, most of the major investment firms have ESG funds. They're not perfect, and they don't always exactly align with Catholic social teaching, but I think they're a start. And those are opportunities for low-cost index funds that incorporate ESG, and those are available in your own investment accounts, whether you have an IRA or a traditional brokerage account. They haven't migrated yet into many of the 401k and 403b plans. I think that's another opportunity for advocacy within your place of employment to try to bring some of those plans into the 401k space so that they can be invested in more broadly as part of people's retirement accounts. And then I think one of the other themes that came up throughout this evening is the importance of learning and engagement. So, within the institutions, organizations that you're a part of, thinking about how you are engaging the finance office, the investment office around values-based investing in financial decisions, and drawing on the lessons we've learned tonight, and through the conference that I know many of you have been a part of. I think that conversation, as Sister Sue said, is really important over time.
Sister Sue.
Well, thank you. I think for us, it's what Elizabeth said, we're better together. We never could do it alone. We cannot do this alone. None of us has all of the answers. We need each other because we as religious are good at what we do, and we need the benefit and the expertise of others who are experts in other areas to walk, and we need to walk together down this path of living our faith to be the truest people we can be.
And David.
I think part of the answer is a reorientation around this idea of impact investing. And what place does it take in how we think about the world? And I think the thing about finance is it's kind of seductive in its sophistication. It makes you think that it's something that's outside of the spiritual. But Christ's comments on that are basically that you can either, you're either going to be, God's either going to be your master, or mammon or money is going to be your master. And so when we have conversations, when we're constantly talking about return, well, then it sounds a lot like we're slaves to return, therefore slaves to the mammon, to the money. And so I think for us as religious/spiritual people, there are core questions we have to ask about where we fall in that spectrum. But I think for me, my journey has been really placing finance where it belongs, which is it is a spiritual landscape. And so then how do we express our values, our deeply spiritually held values in the decisions that we make? And for each of us, wealthy or middle class or whatever it is, there's a way to participate, to Elizabeth's point. And that participation will create, knowledge, certainly. It will sanctify. It will create proximity to the problems of others and then hopefully then generate compassion. I think in a landscape like the one we live in now, it's easy to be hopeless. I was challenged lately by a sermon I heard about mustard seed faith being enough. And I was challenged because I thought, everything about my life is the result of a series of very small yeses. And at the end of it, you look at it and say, this is what your life looks like. But the very first decision that sent you on that journey, maybe you moved the country, maybe you married someone of a different race, or on and on and on. Decisions of just that simple small yes. And I think in our investing, we can start to say those small yeses and then trust in God to lead us where He will.
Thank you. I really want to thank the Francesco Collaborative for helping putting this vital conversation together. I want to just pause because I'd like to invite Felipe, which are co-founder and executive director of the Francesco Collaborative, just to offer a few words before we close this evening.
Just want to underscore a few of the brilliant insights we received tonight. One of the pieces that was interesting to me was Elizabeth starting with kind of this is an existential time. And two pieces that drove that home for me. One was even Cal reflecting on the $135 million in legally mandated compensation that was returned, right? I think it just underscores the nature of our dominant extractive system. That's what it takes to build a workers' rights commission, just to get that, to be repaid to people. I think earlier, David talked about the field is narrowing in economics and has been narrowing for many time. And just that also is a threat to the narrowing of how do we have a broader humanities approach to economics. And then the tried and tacit and failed part of economics too, but then also the truth and healing work that Sister Sue attested to and witnessed to, and I think gives us all the example for in leading. And then the systems level thinking that David said there, and then these small yeses. How are we kind of consistently, what are we saying yes to? And so finally, when we think about our own money, our own assets, our own communities, our own relationships we're weaving, I think each of us has pieces of that puzzle, right? And I think so much of it, with Sister Sue say, we need each other. And part of this is trusting in God's providence undergirds courageous decisions, that was said, right? So how do we deepen each other's trust? How do we help deepen our own trust? And so much of that is the spiritual work, the inner work that allows us to be courageously, boldly building this economy we know is needed. So I want to ask you a quick refrain here. What Sister Sue said was, now that we know differently, we have to do differently. Can you all say that with me? So I'm going to say, now that we know differently, all of you say, now that we know differently. Back over to you, Kim.
Great. Thank you, Felipe. Thank you so much. I just want to do a quick thing. I want to preview some upcoming dialogues for the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. In early December, we'll be hosting a Latino leader gathering on making life unbearable. The impacts of immigration enforcement on communities and families. We've talked a lot about the policy, but this is going to be really looking at what's happening to individuals and communities. We'll focus largely on the way that the Trump administration's immigration enforcement efforts have affected schools, churches, businesses, families, and other essential members of the community across the country. We'll have more information on this gathering on our website in the coming days. Also in January 21, John Carr is not here today. We're going to celebrate our initiative founder, John Carr, 50-year-long career promoting the principles of Catholic social teaching in U.S. public life as he retires. It's going to be such an amazing time. We'll hold a dialogue reflecting on the lessons from his incredible career, featuring New York Times columnist and PBS NewsHour commentator David Brooks, New York Times columnist and Georgetown professor E.J. Dionne, Carrie Robinson, who's the president and CEO of Catholic Charities USA, and Cardinal Joseph Tobin, the Archbishop of Newark, New Jersey. So happy to have so many of you here. We hope that you can stay for a little bit more time and join us for a reception as we continue the conversation. As many of you know, we record all of these conversations. It will be recorded and posted on our website and social media channels for later viewing. And there'll also be follow-up resources from this dialogue on our page as well. And I also just want to stop and thank the incredible team that I work with, but first including the AV team who's recording this for us and the catering team who will feed us and make sure we have things to drink. But importantly, my colleagues, Kim Daniels, John Carr, Chris White, Anna Gordon, Michaela, Christian, and Blaine, and also our student fellows, Kala and Lily, for their support and efforts that make this evening a huge success. Thanks to all of you for joining us here, both here at Georgetown and those of you who are online. And one more time, will you join me in thanking Elizabeth Garlow, Sister Sue Ernster, Cal Watson, and David Harley, and the Francesco Collaborative for being a part of tonight's conversation.